A clueless tourist, eager to pull off the ultimate prank, dresses up as a fake police officer and attempts to arrest a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Expecting laughter and viral fame, he instead finds himself face to face with unshakable discipline and a very real response. Nathan had been planning this for weeks. The idea was simple, but the payoff was going to be legendary. A tourist in London with a camera crew, a fake police uniform, and the audacity to do something that most people would never dare: arrest a royal guard. He had researched it thoroughly. The royal guards were known for their unwavering discipline, standing motionless for hours on end at Buckingham Palace, completely ignoring the crowds of tourists who lined up to take pictures with them. To Nathan, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to pull off the prank of a lifetime. He had no experience in law enforcement, of course, but that didn't matter. All he needed was the uniform, a set of plastic handcuffs, and a bit of confidence. The uniform itself wasn't exactly authentic. He'd found it in a cheap online store, the kind of place that sold Halloween costumes, but to a casual observer, it would look like a legitimate police outfit. The bright reflective vest, the badge pinned to the chest, and the black trousers with a shiny stripe down the side all screamed official. In Nathan's mind, this was going to be a viral hit. Imagine the video. Him striding up to one of the most stoic and disciplined people in the world, a royal guard, and declaring that they were under arrest. It was so absurd that the internet would be buzzing about it for days, maybe even weeks. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that this was going to be hilarious. People would laugh, share the video, and in the end, he'd get thousands of views. The reaction from the guard would be priceless. The idea of someone actually trying to arrest a royal guard? That was comedy gold. Nathan wasn't one to shy away from the spotlight. He had always sought attention, whether from his friends, online followers, or strangers on the street. Pulling pranks was his thing, and the bigger the reaction, the better. This time, he would be the star of the show. He took a deep breath, feeling the rush of excitement as he stepped off the subway at Green Park Station, right near Buckingham Palace. The bustling streets of London felt almost surreal to him today. This wasn't just any normal tourist day. No, today he was in charge. He wasn't just another visitor snapping photos of the guards from a distance. He was about to make history. As he made his way toward the palace, he could already see the royal guards standing motionless in their iconic red uniforms and bearskin hats. Nathan's heart raced. The plan was simple: march right up to one of them, claim they were under arrest for loitering in a public space, and see how they reacted. He imagined the video of the bewildered guard, the confusion in his eyes, followed by the crowd bursting into laughter. Maybe the guard would even try to push him away, or better yet, maybe he'd even try to fight back. Nathan was sure it would all go down in history as the greatest prank ever filmed. He took one last look in the reflective glass of a nearby shop window to check his uniform. He adjusted the badge, tightened his belt, and put on his most serious expression. No one would be able to tell that this was all an act. To the crowd, he was just another cop keeping an eye on things. With his camera crew behind him, Nathan made his way confidently towards the line of guards. The tourists were already milling about, taking pictures and admiring the scene. No one noticed him at first as he slipped past the barriers and walked toward the nearest guard. He selected his target, one of the guards standing near the main gates, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of the bearskin hat. The guard was completely still, his eyes locked straight ahead, unfazed by the crowd around him. Perfect. Too perfect. Nathan took a deep breath and stepped into the guard's line of sight. He squared his shoulders, adjusted his fake police hat, and cleared his throat. The moment of truth had arrived. This was going to be epic. He raised his hand in an authoritative gesture. The crowd around him, sensing something unusual was happening, began to slow their movements. Whispers spread as Nathan, in his officer voice, began to speak. "And this is a police action," Nathan said, his tone deliberately stern as he approached the guard. "You are under arrest for public disturbance and failure to comply with orders." The camera crew zoomed in, capturing every ridiculous moment of the stunt. The tourists in the background began to murmur and giggle. Some thought it was part of the act, others didn't seem so sure. Nathan felt a sense of power surge through him. He had the crowd's attention, and everything was going according to plan. This was his moment. Little did he know, it was all about to spiral out of control. The guard, however, remained still, not even a twitch. Nathan stepped closer, moving within arm's reach, expecting some kind of reaction, even if it was just a confused look or a playful nudge. But there was nothing. He grinned, trying to play it off. "You know," he continued, "you can make this easy on yourself if you just—" Suddenly, the guard's body shifted ever so slightly. The world seemed to slow down as Nathan realized this was no joke. Something about the way the guard moved. It wasn't casual, it wasn't clumsy. It was precision, and it was done with an authority that Nathan had completely underestimated. Before Nathan could process it, the guard raised his rifle slightly, shifting into a defensive stance. The guard's head didn't move, but his posture and the cold, unwavering discipline in his eyes were unmistakable. The tourists went silent. The cameras kept rolling. It was at that moment Nathan realized something that would change the course of this entire prank. This wasn't funny anymore. And it was about to get much worse. The moment Nathan realized the shift in the guard's posture, his heart skipped a beat. What had started as a light-hearted prank suddenly took a dangerous turn. The stiffening of the guard's body, the subtle but deliberate movement of the rifle, all of it screamed something he hadn't anticipated. Seriousness. Nathan froze for a split second, unsure how to react. The crowd around them, which had been murmuring in amusement, fell into a stunned silence. All eyes were on him now, some people still recording, others unsure whether this was part of the show or something entirely different. He gulped. The military precision in the Royal Guard's stance was now unmistakable. This wasn't some bored, indifferent soldier. This was a man who had been trained to respond to threats, to remain calm in the face of chaos. He wasn't about to let some tourist with a cheap police costume disrupt his duty. For a moment, Nathan's mind raced. He'd been expecting confusion, maybe a few words exchanged, but definitely not this kind of stoic resistance. Was the guard playing along? Surely this had to be part of the act, right? The crowd wasn't moving, but they were definitely intrigued now. Some people even seemed to be shifting in their positions, holding their phones up a little higher to capture what was happening. Nathan forced a smile, but the unease creeping into his stomach was hard to ignore. He took a half step back, trying to regain some control of the situation. "You know," he said, trying to force a light tone, "this doesn't have to get ugly. Just let me make this arrest and everything will be fine. I'm just doing my job here." But the guard didn't respond. His eyes, still obscured by the tall bearskin hat, locked forward as if Nathan didn't even exist. He seemed to be measuring the situation, his attention fully focused, the rifle gently held at his side but ready for action if needed. It was unnerving how calm the guard was. Not a single twitch. Nathan began to feel a prickle of anxiety crawling up his spine. For a moment, Nathan considered backing down. He could still make a run for it, maybe laugh it off later as an awkward but harmless prank. He could even apologize and claim it was a misunderstanding, a misstep in his performance. But something told him this wouldn't be that simple. The guard's sheer presence was starting to weigh on him. He looked around for any sign of support from the crowd. But the tourists, who had been so eager to snap photos just moments ago, were now watching with a strange mix of curiosity and concern. Their smiles had faded, replaced by confusion or outright disbelief. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, it happened. The guard took a single, deliberate step toward Nathan. It was slow, controlled, and yet somehow immensely threatening. The sound of the heavy boots hitting the pavement echoed in Nathan's ears. It wasn't just the physical presence of the guard that felt imposing, it was the sheer authority of it all. Nathan stumbled backward a step, his confidence faltering. He looked to his camera crew, his team still standing frozen behind him, unsure of how to react to the situation they were filming. He felt like the walls were closing in. The guard's hand twitched slightly, moving toward the rifle. The soft, metallic sound of the rifle's strap moving echoed in the silence. Nathan's stomach dropped. This wasn't part of the prank. This wasn't just a game anymore. The royal guard's voice broke through the stillness. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, commanding. "Step back, now!" Nathan froze in place, the command hanging in the air like a weight. His mind was racing. He was caught. He hadn't planned for this. Was this part of the guard's training? To stand still until the threat was neutralized? Was this the point where the situation could escalate? The tourists around him had started to murmur, some whispering nervously, others still filming. The quiet tension seemed to grow by the second. Nathan took another step back, trying to regain his composure. His mouth had gone dry. He needed to de-escalate, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. The royal guard wasn't playing around. This was no longer a prank. It was a standoff. For the first time, Nathan questioned the wisdom of his entire idea. In his mind, it was supposed to be a light-hearted joke, a harmless prank. But now, standing face to face with a trained soldier, he realized how dangerous his plan had been. One wrong move, and he could be arrested or worse. What had he been thinking? He glanced at the royal guard again, his gaze meeting the guard's unflinching eyes. The guard's expression never changed, but Nathan could feel the intensity of the situation, the gravity of his mistake. Another step backward. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest. His entire body felt tense, like a rubber band stretched too far, ready to snap. "Do not approach further," the guard said again, his tone unyielding, almost mechanical. The crowd had now completely fallen silent. There was no laughter, no more murmurs of curiosity. Everyone was watching the face-off between the faux police officer and the immovable royal guard. Nathan's mind was racing for an out, a way to stop this before it went too far. But the fear that was growing inside him made it hard to think clearly. He knew he was inches away from something far more serious than he could handle. He took another step back, the real possibility of being taken down by a royal guard hitting him full force. The videos from this would not be funny or viral. They would be a disaster. And as he stepped backward again, his foot hit the edge of the stone curb. He lost his balance for just a moment, stumbling back, almost falling into the crowd. The royal guard's gaze never left him. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had grown larger, and the buzz of the city's pulse seemed to synchronize with the growing tension in the air. The tourist, now fully emboldened by the reactions of those around him, was ready to make his move. He had studied the behavior of the royal guard for some time, watching their impeccable stillness and understanding how to blend into the surroundings. However, he had no intention of blending in today. No, today was about taking control, manipulating the situation to his advantage. He'd already planted the seed in the minds of the onlookers, planting the idea that the guards weren't just ceremonial, but in fact, official law enforcement. Now he had to make his next move seem legitimate. Without hesitation, he straightened his posture and pushed his way through the throngs of people toward the royal guard who stood silently at his post. The crowd remained none the wiser. Some of them still assumed he was an off-duty officer, perhaps a private security guard, even if his uniform was slightly askew and obviously fake. But the tourist had anticipated the doubt. With one smooth motion, he stepped into the square, moving deliberately, with the air of someone who had authority. The royal guard in front of him was unmoving as usual, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but there was something almost unnerving about the way the tourist approached, his body language filled with false confidence. "You're under arrest," the tourist said loudly, his voice carrying over the hushed whispers of the nearby crowd. "Step away from your post immediately. You're obstructing justice." A few of the onlookers began to stir, murmuring, but most were too confused to respond. They simply watched, unsure of how to react to this bizarre spectacle. The royal guard didn't flinch. His stance remained as disciplined and rigid as ever, but the eyes of the bystanders flicked between the two men. The tourist's smile widened as he saw the confusion flicker across the faces of the crowd. He thought for a moment that he had won, but the silence that followed his declaration seemed to stretch on forever, the air thick with anticipation. He could feel the tension rising. He had expected the guard to react, to flinch, even to show some sign of fear or hesitation, but there was nothing. No movement, no acknowledgement. The royal guard's face, cold and unyielding, stared straight ahead, betraying nothing of the situation unfolding right in front of him. It was as though he hadn't heard the tourist's command. At that moment, the tourist's heart began to race. Something wasn't right. He had expected at least some form of confrontation, but instead, the guard seemed entirely impervious to his presence. Sweat beaded on the tourist's forehead as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. His next move would have to be quick. He had to make it appear like this was an official act, or he would lose all the ground he had gained. Ignoring the warning signs of discomfort creeping up his spine, the tourist stepped closer, now standing inches away from the guard's immobile form. He raised his hand dramatically, as if signaling the arrest, and made his final attempt to assert control over the scene. "You're defying orders," the tourist said, his voice a little less sure now, but still projecting authority. "You're not above the law. This is an official arrest. You are coming with me." The guard didn't move, didn't blink. His unflinching resolve only seemed to deepen the tourist's confusion. The minutes felt like hours, and the entire world seemed to narrow down to that one moment, the two of them, face to face in a standoff that would either make or break his entire plan. The eyes of the bystanders were on him, waiting for something to happen. The tourist's pulse quickened. But still, nothing. Then, without warning, the royal guard finally moved. Not in the way the tourist had expected. There was no sudden burst of aggression, no dramatic action. Instead, with a single, quiet motion, the guard's arm reached up, so fluidly that it was almost imperceptible, and placed his hand on the tourist's shoulder. The crowd grew quiet, uncertain. The guard's grip was firm, but not harsh. His hand was calm, composed, as if he were handling something delicate rather than preparing for a fight. And then, in a voice as calm as the stillness in the air, the royal guard spoke. "You will leave, now." The words were not loud, they were not harsh, but they carried the weight of authority. The tourist, for the first time in this entire strange encounter, felt the unmistakable force of control, and it wasn't his own. His throat tightened. The breath he had been holding seemed to catch in his chest. For all his planning, all his bravado, he realized something critical. In that moment, it wasn't about power or authority. It was about discipline. The royal guard hadn't needed to do anything other than remain calm and composed. That single gesture, that brief but commanding touch on his shoulder, conveyed all the power the tourist had been trying to summon with his counterfeit authority. And now, as the crowd held its collective breath, the realization hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. This wasn't just some public spectacle. This was something deeper, The guard had won. And the tourist's only option now was to retreat, knowing full well that his moment had passed and his mission was over. The tourist stood frozen, his entire body betraying the overwhelming sense of panic that surged within him. He had never expected this. The royal guard's calm, measured response, just a single touch, a subtle movement, had completely undone everything he thought he knew about authority and control. In the presence of this unmoving, disciplined figure, he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The crowd, sensing the change in the atmosphere, grew quieter. Some people were now filming the encounter with their phones. Others whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible. Yet none of them dared to intervene. It was as if a collective understanding had formed. The tourist had made a dangerous miscalculation. The royal guard's grip on his shoulder remained, steady and unyielding. The tourist could feel the weight of it, the quiet pressure that spoke of years of discipline and unspoken power. It wasn't physical force. It was simply the authority of someone who had been trained to withstand chaos, to stand his ground, to uphold the law, no matter what. And here, now, in the heart of Buckingham Palace, that authority was undeniable. The moment seemed to stretch on, seconds bleeding into minutes. The tourist's bravado had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of humiliation. His chest tightened with anxiety as the realization of his failure sank in. He had thought he could outsmart the system, but now he could see how foolish he truly was. His actions had drawn attention, but not the kind he had wanted. There was no applause, no admiration, only the cold stare of the royal guard and the muted whispers of the crowd. Slowly, the guard spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "You will leave. Now." The words were simple, but the command they carried was clear. The tourist tried to speak, to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say or how to salvage any shred of dignity from the situation. The weight of the guard's hand on his shoulder didn't lessen, but seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. Realizing he had no choice, the tourist took a small step back, his eyes flicking to the crowd. The onlookers were still watching, some amused, some curious, but none of them seemed ready to come to his aid. This was not a scene that could be easily spun into a victory, no matter how he tried to manipulate the narrative. For a brief, terrible moment, he considered escalating the situation, perhaps shouting, maybe pushing back, but something in the guard's unyielding posture kept him rooted in place. The guard had not moved since he had placed his hand on the tourist's shoulder. He hadn't even acknowledged the tourist's movements, his gaze still fixed straight ahead, as though the tourist's existence no longer mattered. Without another word, the tourist took a slow step back. His legs felt unsteady, as though they had lost all their strength. The cool air around Buckingham Palace felt suddenly oppressive, almost suffocating. He was defeated. His plan had failed. And now, all that was left for him was to slink away in disgrace, with nothing but the echoes of his arrogance ringing in his ears. As he turned to leave, the sound of footsteps followed him. The guard's shadow was still there, looming just behind him. The pressure on his shoulder remained, like an invisible hand pushing him further away from the scene of his failure. The tourist couldn't help but feel like a child caught in a moment of mischief, no longer the brave figure he had once imagined himself to be, but a small, insignificant figure caught in the cold reality of his own mistakes. The crowd began to murmur again, but this time it was different. They weren't watching the tourist anymore. They were watching the royal guard. Some whispered their admiration for his composure, while others still seemed to question what had just occurred. But no one came to the tourist's defense. He had been caught in his own web of lies and bluster, and now he was nothing more than another anonymous face in the crowd. He walked past the barricades, his head down, the weight of his failure pressing harder with every step. The guard's presence loomed in the back of his mind, and as he reached the edge of the crowd, he could feel the sting of defeat, the bitter taste of his own arrogance. He had tried to overpower an immovable force, and failed. But what truly hurt was the understanding that this was not just about the royal guard. It was about something deeper. The realization that he had tried to gain power by pretending to be something he wasn't, and in doing so, had lost everything. His confidence, his dignity, and his pride, all shattered by the calm, unspoken strength of a single, unwavering figure. The tourist stepped out of the crowd and into the streets of London, the sounds of the city buzzing around him, but nothing could drown out the feeling of utter humiliation that followed him down the path he had once been so eager to take. The tourist's retreat through the streets of London was not as triumphant as he had imagined it would be. In fact, every step he took felt heavier than the last, weighed down not by the physical distance, but by the crushing sense of defeat that seemed to grow with each passing moment. He had come to Buckingham Palace full of bravado, convinced he could outsmart the system, to play the role of an impostor and succeed in the most audacious of schemes. But instead, he had been utterly crushed, not by force, but by the quiet, immovable authority of the royal guard. As he wandered aimlessly through the streets, the sounds of the city around him seemed distant and muffled. The usual hum of London, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the hurried footsteps of tourists, was a blur in his ears. The only thing he could hear clearly was the voice in his head, repeating the same words over and over. I failed. I was caught. I underestimated them. His thoughts swirled with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and frustration. How could I have been so stupid? He thought, his mind replaying the scene in an endless loop. The image of the royal guard, standing tall and calm, unwavering in the face of his deception, was seared into his memory. That was the moment he realized he had underestimated the discipline and authority behind the uniform. It wasn't just the guard who had won. It was everything he had stood for, the traditions, the honor, and the unspoken power of the royal guard. With every step he took, the sting of the situation intensified. He tried to push the thoughts aside, telling himself that it wasn't the end of the world, that he could move on and forget about the humiliation. But the reality was that he couldn't. The guard had been silent, but his presence had spoken volumes. It was a humbling reminder of the boundaries that shouldn't be crossed and the respect that had to be earned, not faked. He found himself walking without a clear destination, his mind consumed by the weight of his actions. The thrill of trying to deceive the system, of playing the role of the fake authority, had seemed appealing at first. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his failure, it all seemed childish and naive. There was no glory in what he had attempted. There was only the quiet realization that he had done something foolish, something that now seemed utterly pointless. As he continued through the streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that people were still watching him. It wasn't that he was being physically followed, but he felt exposed, like the eyes of the crowd from Buckingham Palace were still on him, judging him, silently mocking him. Every passerby seemed to notice his downcast eyes, the slump in his shoulders, the defeat that radiated from him. The bold tourist who had come to London with ideas of grandeur was now just another face in the crowd, humbled by his own arrogance. Hours passed, though it felt like no time at all. The city had transformed from the bustling streets of tourists to the quieter, dimming corners of London as evening settled in. The tourist found himself standing near the River Thames, looking out over the water as the city lights flickered on, reflecting off the surface in shimmering lines. It was a beautiful sight, yet it did nothing to lift the dark cloud hanging over him. The thoughts kept coming, unrelenting. What had driven him to try such a stunt in the first place? Was it boredom, a desire for attention, or something deeper? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his need for validation, for recognition, had clouded his judgment. He had imagined that wearing a fake police uniform and trying to intimidate a royal guard would somehow make him feel powerful, important. But now, in the aftermath of his failure, he realized how fragile that illusion had been. He sat down on a bench by the water, his gaze fixed on the distant skyline. The towering buildings of London stood like silent witnesses to his disgrace. He could still hear the faint whispers of the crowd from Buckingham Palace, and the stern, unflinching voice of the royal guard echoing in his mind. "You will leave, now." The words had carried with them a finality that was hard to shake off. There was no argument, no way to fight back. The power of the royal guard wasn't just in the uniform. It was in the silent authority they wielded, in their ability to remain composed no matter the circumstances. And in that moment, the tourist understood that true strength was not in the ability to deceive or outsmart others, but in the ability to stand firm, unshaken, no matter the pressure. The tourist realized that this experience would stay with him for a long time, perhaps for the rest of his life. The embarrassment, the humiliation, the sinking feeling of failure. It was all part of the lesson he had learned the hard way. He had tried to challenge the system, but in doing so, he had only exposed his own weaknesses. He wasn't a hero or a mastermind. He was just another person who had tried to take on something greater than himself and failed. As night fell, he got up from the bench and walked away, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. But with each step, he felt a little lighter. He might never live down the foolishness of what he had done, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never again underestimate the power of quiet, unwavering authority.